In a conference remembering women in the spirit of the New Deal, Kirstin Downey is a fit subject herself. Not only through her award-winning biography of Frances Perkins, the woman behind the New Deal, but through her 20 years of reporting on the Washington Post, doing award-winning investigation of the financial manipulations that almost produced another Great Depression. Kirstin has demonstrated that commitment to analytical rigor and social justice characteristic of New Dealers like Frances Perkins. The world is her oyster. The daughter of a ship captain, she grew up in places as far apart as the Panama Canal Zone and Hawaii. And even now, splits her time with her husband Neil, who's here today, between Hawaii and Washington, D.C. After her biography of Secretary Perkins, she researched and wrote another prize-winning biography of another remarkable woman, Queen Isabella, the warrior queen. I'm not allowed, I didn't think, to describe her current project, but suffice it to say, she is still plying the 7 seas. Kirstin and I met after she was given a copy of my unpublished essay, The Frances Perkins I Knew, which I wrote the year after Miss Perkins' death in 1966. She died in 65. It gave Kirstin some material on Perkins' life as a visiting professor at Cornell University, and particularly as a resident during the last 5 years of her life at Telluride House, a male residence hall on campus, which became the first coeducational student residence hall in the nation while Frances Perkins was a resident. A coincidence worth the shrewd investigatory eye of our next speaker, whose book on Frances Perkins has literally brought this most remarkable leader back into the national consciousness. Through my essay, we got to know each other, and she introduced me to Tomlin Coggeshall, Frances Perkins' grandson, who is here in the audience as well, and the folks who created the Frances Perkins Center, on whose board I have sat ever since. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear, dear friend, Kirstin Downey.
I'm delighted to be here in California talking about my favorite subject, the life of Frances Perkins. And I've got to say that it's a particular delight to be in front of a group where people know who Frances Perkins is. I'll tell you, it's a rare and special crowd. You know, when I started on the journey of looking into Frances Perkins' life, I didn't know that much about her myself. I thought I would learn a lot about the woman who, one of the most important women in American history. But 10 years later, by the time I was done with my research, I'd come to believe that she was the most effective single progressive, male or female, in American history. Now, Susan Ives has asked me to talk today about how Frances Perkins accomplished so many things, and that's what I'm going to try to do. But first, I want to briefly remind you of all the things she did. Now, you know, she spent her early life in New England, where she was very much influenced by the values of New England. And her family homestead was in Damariscotta, Maine, where there's an effort being made to purchase the home and restore it, and to make it a center for progressive leadership going forward. There's a number of people here from the Frances Perkins Center. I really hope you'll reach out and talk to them. What better thing could we have in America right now than an incubator for people who will use the tools Frances Perkins developed to help make the world a better place? Perkins left her home, childhood home, and she went to study at Mount Holyoke. And I just bet we've got a few Mount Holyoke women in this room. As you know, Mount Holyoke has a long and proud tradition of supporting social justice. Under Mary Lyons, who was the original founder, the school prepared women for lives as essentially missionaries, or you might say emissaries, for making a better world. Perkins' motto in her senior year was, "Be ye steadfast." and that certainly turned out to be a prediction of what she was going to face in her adult life. After Perkins graduated, she moved to Chicago, and she began volunteering at Hull House, which was part of the massive settlement house movement that brought rich and poor together to work on pressing social problems like tainted food supplies, bad sanitation, bad drinking water. Bad drinking water then, bad drinking water now. There's still some work to be done. Perkins took what she'd learned at Mount Holyoke and Hull House to heart, and she moved on to a social work position at the National Consumers League in New York City, where she worked on analyzing and exposing the bad workplace conditions that were rampant in New York and really in every major city at that time in America. Now, in her early 30s, just as she was immersed in this work, she was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist fire. Now, I don't need to tell you too much about this. In fact, I met over breakfast today someone whose grandmother was a survivor of the fire. All I can tell you, just to sum up, more than 100 workers, crowded tenement. They were working on a Saturday afternoon because, remember, back then, there were no limitations on work hours, and men and women typically worked 60 hours a week or more. In fact, a quarter of American children at that time worked more than 60 hours a week. Now, as a result of the fire and seizing that moment of public horror, Perkins drafted the laws that became the International Fire Code. And we see an exit sign here. There's some water sprinklers above us. These are all the things that she initiated and started going: fire escapes, exit signs, limitations on flammable trash. She got these things enacted in New York City when she was just in her early 30s. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved in the United States, millions globally, because these standards were eventually enacted globally. A few years later, when she was in her mid-30s, she became president of the Maternity Center Association in New York City. And at that time, maternal death rates and infant mortality rates in the United States were among the highest in the developed world. So she was at the forefront of a movement of women taking back control over their bodies and their health. Perkins and her allies trained and employed a corps of nurses to provide free prenatal and postnatal care, which was offered at a network of more than a dozen clinics that Perkins administered in New York City. These concepts for well baby care spread across the country. We saw a number of examples of how they were rolled out in the New Deal. They've saved millions of lives. Now, capitalizing on those achievements, Perkins joined the state administration of New York Governor Al Smith, and later New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, when Perkins was in her early 30s, FDR was elected president, and he asked her to join his administration to serve as Secretary of Labor. Now, a lot of people lobbied for Perkins to get that job and did so effectively, but I just like to point that she'd been working with him for 8 years as his own industrial commissioner, so she really didn't need an introduction. She reluctantly agreed to become his Secretary of Labor, demanding first that he allow her to take her best shot at enacting a raft of social programs that were designed to boost employment, improve working standards for America, and provide financial support for the elderly. This was not a platform that Roosevelt had run on. She was extraordinarily successful on the list of things that she told Perkins she told Roosevelt she wanted to undertake. She was the primary architect of the Social Security Act, which passed in 1935, which also gave us unemployment insurance and our welfare system, later known as Aid to Dependent Children, which was designed to help the children of impoverished single mothers and boost them out of poverty. As a result of the Social Security Act, there are more than 62 million people in the United States receiving Social Security benefits, earned as a result of their employment during their own working years. Many senior citizens in America would be indigent without Social Security. The Fair Labor Standards Act, something she had fought for years, passed in 1938, and she played a key role in both drafting and administering it. It set limitations on work hours, created a minimum wage, a ban on child labor, and the creation of the concept of overtime pay to discourage employers from demanding long hours of work. She was also a leader in the president's cabinet in a number of other ways. I could go on and on. She was a major supporter of FHA insurance, which has enabled millions of Americans to buy and own comfortable homes. To deal with the real estate slump that accompanied the Great Depression, Frances Perkins also backed a program called the Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, which refinanced mortgages into fixed-rate mortgages paid off over 20 years that allowed people who would have otherwise lost their homes to keep them. It was a nice and simple program. The program was folded when it was no longer needed. And I just like to put a little barbed aside here. Perkins and Roosevelt didn't bail out the banks, they bailed out the people who were in danger of losing their homes. Now, joblessness was a big problem during the Depression, so Frances Perkins supported an expansion of federal employment as a way to put jobless workers back to work. Now, she and FDR didn't believe in giving out money as handouts. They believed that people would feel better and develop real skills if they worked for what they earned. So she was the primary architect of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put 3 million young men and women to work on national parks. Now, this was FDR's idea, but as he often did, he left her to work out the details. It cost a pittance, and it taught many young people valuable work skills: conservation, forestry, construction, even car mechanics. Frances Perkins also pressed for public works, and some of the things they built are really the staples of our infrastructure system even today. The Lincoln Tunnel, the LaGuardia Airport, the bridge to the Florida Keys. We could go on and on. Arts programs she supported put artists and architects and playwrights and oral historians and, yes, librarians to work. At the core of all of this was providing people with meaningful work that enriches all of our lives. We could go on for hours talking and citing the projects that came as a result of these programs. And this weekend, we're going to get to see and hear about a number of them. Projects and programs that are still providing enjoyment and meaningful insight for all of us 100 years later. Then there's what she did for labor. Perkins helped draft the rule that specifically and for the first time in America gave workers the right to organize, to collectively bargain for better wages and benefits. She also prevented federal troops from being dispatched to kill strikers, which was how previous administrations had handled labor unrest. Her efforts succeeded. When Perkins went to Washington, only 5% of workers were unionized, about half of today's level, and by the time she died, about a third of the American workforce was unionized, propelling millions of people into the middle class for the first time. I could tell you other things, but I think I hit the high points. That's a lot for one lifetime. Any one of those things would have, should have, made her a famous person. Well, Susan wants us to talk about how she actually did it. This is so incredibly timely and an even frightening topic, given where we are today in our political discourse. And I wrestled with this topic while I was preparing for the talk. I thought I'd start with a few of her personal characteristics. These are just so useful to incorporate into your own life anyway. She was a tireless networker. She consciously crafted her persona to be as effective as possible. She corresponded with hundreds of people over the course of her lifetime. She was an excellent listener, which made her a beloved friend to many of the people who met her, because everyone so much wants to be heard. Even the most powerful person feels that they aren't really being heard. And by really listening to both the powerless and the powerful, she made friends that lasted a lifetime. This is the part I'd like to say that is a little bit touchier. Much of what she accomplished also came as a result of a quality that some people now consider evil: a propensity to compromise and work across party lines. Today, politicians are measured by their supporters, even honored by members of their parties, for how virulently they can denounce the other side. That's something Frances Perkins never did. Instead, she forged important alliances and maintained those friendships over a lifetime, regardless of political affiliations. When she was a suffrage leader, for example, standing on a soapbox in a corner, on a public corner, when men would throw rotten vegetables at women who were arguing for the right to vote, she stood there and took the tomatoes and convinced some people and made friends with the other women who were there on the soapbox, some of whom became Republicans, and some of them who became key supporters in her work in the years ahead. Today, some might call her a sellout for doing the best the circumstances would permit, rather than chasing the elusive dream of perfection. She couldn't get everybody covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. In fact, it got watered down very much. At the end, she was very upset. But she did what she could for as many people as she could. Some people criticize her for this. In fact, domestic workers, for example, and farm workers were exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act. But I once tracked the numbers down to try to figure out how many people she'd helped. And at that time, more than 12 million people were covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Many of them got boosts in wages, they got their hours reduced, children were ushered back into schoolhouses as a result of the legislation. Was it perfect? No. But for the first time, many workers began to get out of work each day while it was still light outside, while they could still play ball or enjoy a walk in the park. Perkins looked everywhere for allies. For improving fire safety codes, which would mean saving lives, she turned to insurance industry executives who wanted to reduce their losses. They were mostly Republican, but she made common cause with them. They wanted to save money, and they backed her legislation. She won their respect. And there's an important word I'd like to raise again: respect. Perkins had deep disagreements with her opponents and enemies. She was vilified. She didn't get any fawning newspaper coverage at all. Newspaper reporters regularly attacked her to cover favor with the corporate titans who employed them and who paid their salaries. Perkins was dealing with economic issues, and it made her easy to attack. Perkins even suffered an impeachment attempt when she was accused of being soft on immigration. But she never insulted people on the opposing side. She disputed their facts, but never attacked their integrity or acted like they were miserable, contemptible creatures. She disagreed with many things Herbert Hoover did as president, for example, and there was much to criticize, but she never ridiculed him. And this is actually kind of self-evident. If you insult someone, they will never forget the insult, no matter what happens later. Giving people nasty nicknames, calling them deplorables, people remember that. In the newspaper, it's the same. I noticed Thomas Friedman this week talking about party strife, called Republicans insane. And I heard Lou Dobbs last week call Democrats Democrats, making it harder for any of those people to shift allegiance for positive action later. Now, this was part of Perkins' genius. She was a master at working across party lines to build coalitions, to get things done without alienating people she might need later. She knew that a person who's on the opposing side on one issue can be an ally on another. The Civilian Conservation Corps is a great example. By giving good jobs to young people, helping them to get a launch on life, many got opportunities they would have never had otherwise. The program had wide and universal support across the political spectrum. In fact, it was one New Deal program that was never repealed. It would be great to bring it back. And she also did something else that would cause her to be criticized today. She picked her spots and didn't try to represent herself as ideologically pure. She didn't publicly jump on every popular cause, no matter what support she might have been giving privately. The Maternity Center Association, which did such a good job of providing free health care to poor women, many of them immigrants, relied on financial support from rich people to function. Some of their most generous benefactors were wealthy conservative women who wanted to help babies and children grow into healthy adults, but were opposed to birth control and pregnancy termination. Perkins decided it was more important to provide care for as many people as possible instead of jeopardizing care for all by alienating a major group of supporters. Perkins instead quietly threw her support to another new organization that was forming, that wanted specifically to provide contraception and the means to avoid pregnancy. That fledgling group, whose nurses were trained by the Maternity Center Association, became Planned Parenthood. You know, as I prepared my speech today, I wondered whether Frances Perkins would be as successful today as she was then, not just because Republicans have changed, and God knows they have, but because Democrats have changed too. I hope that's not true, and that the Frances Perkinses sitting among us here today can win the support and acceptance from all of us that will enable social progress to come to a new generation. That's the best we can do to honor Frances Perkins, that it's possible to do this in whatever sphere we're undertaking, and avoid undermining efforts that are good, that may not pass a universal litmus test. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to take your questions.